In Exodus 21 shows up essentially right. We have Exodus 19, and we saw already, especially 19:3-6, where we have essentially a general statement about truly listening to God's voice and keeping the covenant, right? Without giving specifics, though we had the goal of that was to be God's missional people in the world, to the world, and for the world, actually as holy missional people, right? So we had kingdom of priests, holy nation. So remember then that Exodus 19-24 then kind of frames this out. This is a general statement if we want to think of IBS terms. This is really important to see this in this part of Exodus. And by the way, this structure also repeats in Deuteronomy 5-26, okay? And I'll show you what I mean here. So there we have a general statement. You know, what is God's will for God's people? They say, what's their response to grace? Again, grace is the driver of all of this. So grace leads to covenant, which leads to faithfulness, right? Okay, so what does it mean to truly listen to God's voice and keep the covenant? Well, this whole section here from Exodus 19-24 gives us a snapshot. First, we get the 10 Commandments. Again, the 10 Commandments begin with grace. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Okay? Now, the 10 Commandments put some flesh on this section here. So here we have a summary of what it means to keep the covenant with 10 statements. But those still are very broad. So they're more specific, but they're still fairly broad. And so we get particulars. So we have a general statement leading to the particulars. And the most particular section that we have here is what's known as the Book of the Covenant, which basically gives us more specific ways to apply the 10 Commandments. Again, that's somewhat of a controversial piece, but I think you can see this both here in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, that Israel's discrete, very specific laws in some way go back to the broad summary that's in the 10 Commandments. Now, what's interesting about that is this gives us a framework for ethical reflection. That's what I want you to note here. There's a way to think through things. So even though these particular laws may not seem like they're relevant in the modern world. So, you know, we have don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. We have laws about ox goring. We have laws about slavery, which is one of the texts that we worked on for this week. What this gives us, though, is you can back up and see the process of taking broad principles to specific application, which the idea then is you don't have to take literally necessarily the commands as we come into the 21st century, but you can see how the scriptural reflection takes place, and so you can see what Israel's ethical system might look like in our modern world through the process of evaluation or application. But we have a model here for ethical reflection, right? And so one of the questions you also want to ask, what does a community look like that lives out this ethos or ethic? Important question, right? And so this gets us back to the idea of how does this help Israel to serve as a witness, what are our ethical commitments that we make today as followers of Jesus? How does that serve as an ethical witness to the world around us? Those are key questions. So this isn't just about bunkered in mentality. This is about the witness to the wider world, which is why it's really interesting that in the book of the covenant, you can roughly say it's chapters 21 through 23 of Exodus, but really it goes back to the very last paragraph of chapter 20 of Exodus. And notice the laws that it begins with. Really begins with 20. This is going to be Exodus 2022 through 23. Really, the laws themselves kind of end at 19, but we can take it all the way through 23, verse 23 here, just to make sure we have the whole thing in place. Not 23, 33. So Exodus, and notice again, the language of Exodus 22 sounds very much like the language of Exodus 19, especially verses 4. So you want to just note the similarities. It makes this really a tight section. And now look at the first two laws that show up here. If you're in my Exodus class, you had the opportunity to work on 21, 1 to 11, which is the law of the slaves. And so the first two sets of laws that we have here are the law of how to build an altar to God. That's roughly, it's verses 20, verse 23 through 26, where we have the reminders about not having other gods before the Lord, and then how to make an altar. And then the very next law, 21, 1 to 11, is what to do about Hebrew slaves. Now, you might think, what in the heck's even a law about slavery doing in a book that it's called the Exodus, the way out, right? A book that talks about the liberation of God's people from slavery. Again, one of the statements that God makes about himself, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So you might see this as hypocritical, but again, do the careful exegesis. Slavery is a given in the ancient world, and I don't want to minimize that, and that's a whole nother lecture. But notice what the scriptures do. It confronts a human given, and in a broader argument is the canon itself eliminates slavery, right? And so you really can't find a positive statement about slavery in the Bible. I don't think that's an overstatement. An example here, this actually subverts claims about slavery, even in this text, and there's other texts in the Pentateuch about slavery. But notice that, and if you read this text carefully, it's releasing male slaves after 6 years of service and giving protections to female slaves. If you look at the parallel in Deuteronomy 15, both male and female are released after 6 years. And then in Leviticus, no Hebrews can be slaves at all. So there's already a movement away from this. But the key point is what the scriptures do, which I love, is it confronts immediately the issues of injustice here and then proper worship of God. And so if we go back to thinking of the overarching framework that Israel's ethic is, you see it illustrated in these first two things, because this is talking about not having other gods before Yahweh, and then this proper worship. And this is talking about protections for a marginalized group. And so if you flip that, I mean, what's the bigger principles that are here? This is talking about loving God, and this is talking about love of neighbor. To avoid the flips of those and the constant temptation in the Old Testament, which was what's the opposite of loving God? It's not hating God. It's idolatry or syncretism, the improper recognition of who the transcendent Yahweh is by worshiping him just like you would any other god, or worshiping him alongside other gods. So that deals with the issue of idolatry and syncretism. And then we have love of neighbor, right? What's the opposite? It's pretty easy. It's injustice. And so the biblical ethic is illustrated immediately in the very first two specific laws of the Book of the Covenant. And so, again, I want you just to see this framework, because this is some of the hardest text to read in the Old Testament. A lot of times we get bogged down reading through the laws, but embedded in there, again, case studies of what does it look like for a community to live out the love for God, love for neighbor. You know, I'm Brian Russell, and it's great to present this to you. And until see you next time, live by faith, be known by love, be a voice of hope to others. Let me know if you have any questions. And again, I'll look forward to seeing you in another video.